Hello, everybody. Welcome to The Past is Not the Past, co-presented by Pseudo Solidarity and Densho. My name is Daryn Wakasa, pronouns he, him, and I will be your moderator for today. I know we have a handful of people kind of entering the room still, but for sake of people's time and schedule, we'll kind of get rolling. Quick disclaimer, we will maintain kind of like a presentation mode, so everybody's microphones will be off. And the reason being is that Tsuru specifically has had some Zoom disruptors, I'll just call them. And so in order to maintain a safe environment and to really just center our own community through this platform, everybody will be muted until the Q&A section. Quick preview of what's going to happen today. We are going to go into a 30-minute presentation with Dr. Donna Nagata about her Yonsei Project research. And then that will be followed by a 30-minute panel discussion with Brandon Shimoda and Dr. Satsuki Ina. And then we will end this program with a 30-minute Q&A. So without further ado, Donna, do you want to pop on and give a brief introduction of who you are? And then I'll pass the mic and spotlight over to you so you could do your thing.
Great. Thanks very much, Daryn. I appreciate the introduction. And as Daryn just mentioned, Donna Nagata. I'm a faculty member in psychology at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And what I'm hoping to do to start us off is to say a little bit about the research that I've been doing and share some of the preliminary findings with you. First, I also want to thank both Densho and Tsuru for Solidarity for co-hosting this event. I'm really grateful for all the support that they have given to the project and for this evening. So I'm going to share my screen for my presentation, and hopefully everybody can see that. So, all right. So to get us started, I'm going to say a little bit about the project survey itself. And beginning with the goal of the Yonsei Project was to explore the impacts of the World War II incarceration on fourth generation Yonsei. Before talking about the findings from this research, I'd like to give you a little background around my motivations for conducting it. As a third generation Sansei, I have a personal connection to the topic. Both my mother and father and their families were incarcerated during the war. And as an academic psychologist, my research has been centered on examining the long-term psychosocial consequences of the incarceration. Prior to conducting this Yonsei study, I've conducted two other projects, one that explored second-generation Nisei perspectives on their past incarceration and redress, and another that examined third-generation Sansei on the incarceration. So why am I studying the Yonsei right now? First, in tracking the long-term impacts of the camps, it makes sense to look at the next generation of adults. But also, the Yonsei have grown up in a very different socio-cultural environment than their Nisei parents. For example, most Yonsei have grown up with more access to resources related to the incarceration. For example, there are now greater numbers of ethnic studies courses and organizations related to Japanese American issues. Plus, the internet has the potential to connect Yonsei with other Japanese Americans beyond their geographic locations. In addition, many Yonsei are multiracial, and this was not as prevalent in previous generations. The Yonsei Project survey was an online, anonymous survey that had two main sections. The largest section included multiple rating scales that assessed a wide variety of topics, such as family communication about the camps, how often you think about the incarceration losses, ethnic identity, belief in a just world, experiences with Asian American racism, and self-esteem. The second section consisted of open-ended questions, asking about a respondent's views on how the incarceration impacted their lives. A total of approximately 700 people responded overall and completed at least 90% of this rather long survey. My focus today, and this is why I've asterisked the second part, the open-ended, is only to look at the responses to those open-ended questions. So who's included in the current findings? Amongst that approximately 700 who completed the survey, 476 Yonsei answered the open-ended question. These are Yonsei who are included in today's findings. They all had a family linked to the incarceration, and the sample was represented by the characteristics below. Included were, in this particular set of findings, are people who were 18 to 50 years old with an average age of 32. Most of the respondents were women, and they came from some 35 states, participants in the open-ended questions. The majority were from California, Washington, New York, Illinois, and Oregon. The specific question in this open-ended part was what I have shown here. In what ways do you feel the incarceration has affected your own life? So given that there were over 450 Yonsei responses submitted, I needed to find a way to summarize these comments. To do this, my research assistants and I reviewed all of the comments that were entered and developed a coding system that captured representative themes. These themes are what I'm presenting here. Before doing that, there are a couple of things I'd like to keep in mind, have you keep in mind. As you saw, the question is quite broad, and as a result, people varied in how much they wrote. Some wrote very long sets of comments, others were very brief. Some mentioned several themes in their response, and others mentioned just one theme. Second, these comments reflected what came to mind to the people taking the survey. That is, what was most salient to them after reading the question prompt in that moment. They were not asked to describe all of their experienced impacts from the incarceration. And also, please keep in mind that these are preliminary as opposed to final findings. After coding all the responses into themes, we calculated the frequencies with which the themes were mentioned to get a sense of which ones were most represented. From that, we then created a graph based on those totals, which is shown in this next slide. So let me explain a little bit about what you're looking at. The bottom of the graph shows the themes that were mentioned. So you can see it going from identity all the way to the low end of friends and relationship. The left side of the graph shows the percentage of respondents who mentioned each theme. And the number on the top of each of the black bars shows the number of respondents who mentioned that particular theme. The themes, as you can see, are presented left to right in descending order of frequency. So you can see that the most mentioned theme toward the left was identity. 150 out of the 476 respondents, which was about a third, noted that the incarceration had impacted their sense of identity in some way. The second most frequent theme was social justice. And here, 119, or about 25% of the total, wrote comments that the camps had impacted their views about social justice. So there's a lot to absorb in this graph here, but the main idea is to give you a visual sense of how frequently each theme was included in the Yonsei responses. The red line outlines the 11 most mentioned ones, and I'll say a bit more about those in specifics. You'll also notice that the theme titles along the bottom of this graph are very brief. So to give a better sense of what people shared, I'm going to go through those most mentioned themes and provide sample quotes that really are much more descriptive of the Yonsei experience. So as I noted, the most mentioned area of impact concerned identity. which was mentioned by nearly 32% of the respondents. These were largely negative impacts centered on lost connection with Japanese identity, culture, and Japanese American culture. Since this was the most prominent theme, I wanted to share several quotes that respondents offered. "I feel like I was robbed of having a real culture and a real identity," said one. Another offered, "Much of my personal identity has been rediscovering the culture, language, and history that was not passed down to my mom." Other comments on identity included the following: "Incarceration split up my grandparents' families and led to my own childhood on the East Coast, being mostly disconnected from any Japanese American community. So I also feel a loss of culture, language, and a strong sense of community." Another said, "Because of cultural suppression and hyper-Americanization of incarcerees, I'm disconnected from Japanese American history and culture, despite being treated as a foreigner who is pressured to know Japanese language and culture." And finally, another example: "It makes me sad. I feel a strong pull to learn more about Japanese culture and try to incorporate it into my life, but often feel like an imposter for learning things from books online rather than lived experience." Some sansei, however, reported a positive impact on identity in that the past incarceration generated a sense of connection with their personal identification and or with the Japanese American community. As shown here, one person said, "It has since made me more proud to embrace my Japaneseness and reclaim the identity, language, religion, and cultural heritage that was lost because of and since the incarceration." Another wrote, "It has created a sense of community with other Japanese Americans, even though I did not grow up in that community until college." Social justice was the second most mentioned theme, noted by about 25% of respondents. For this theme, Yonsei commented on how the incarceration had shaped their awareness of and commitment to addressing injustice. As the first quote says, "I feel a responsibility to listen to survivors and to speak up for or document when other people's rights are violated." And the one below noting that the incarceration is a defining moral compass for my activism, and I endeavor to educate the public about the Japanese American experience so that future generations do not experience the low self-esteem and other issues I had growing up. Impacts on family dynamics were mentioned by close to 1/4 of the respondents. Much of these were negative impacts and included experiencing family silence or an unwillingness to talk freely about the camps, as shown in this top quote here. Growing up, there was so much silence, such a cloudy feeling of loss and shame all the time. And another Yonsei stated, "There's a lot about my family I don't know because incarceration feels like a topic too sensitive to broach." Another dynamic that was mentioned was distance and emotional restraint in the family. And that's reflected in the second quote here on the slide. "Our family didn't talk much or discuss things and feelings freely. I think it held me back a lot from expressing myself the way I should have. Japanese Americans proved themselves by providing for their family and quietly doing as they were expected to do. We got everything we needed to survive, but lacked a lot in emotional well-being." Attitudes towards the US were another area of impact expressed by about 23%. Yonsei described a sense of skepticism or insecurity about the country's government, which they linked to the family past. One noted that the incarceration was a strong reminder that this country was never meant for us. Our rights only extend as far as capitalism allows. Another explained it this way: "I am skeptical of the government and really any authority. I constantly look out for who is in power and how their decisions are affecting marginalized communities." Incarceration impacts around education and career choice were mentioned by about 21% of Yonsei. These comments refer to educating oneself as an avenue for identity exploration, educating others about what happened, or focusing on one's career and centering that on the incarceration itself. In the top quote, the person notes, "It drives me to educate those who never knew of the incarceration and to keep the history alive so it never happens again." And the second note says, "My entire focus professionally has been on writing stories centered on themes of identity, love, and intergenerational trauma stemming from the incarceration. My journey to understand myself and heal my own wounds has centered around this work." 16% of Yonsei also felt that the incarceration created a pressure to assimilate into white society, as reflected in this quote. "Incarceration has made me afraid of admitting that I am of Japanese heritage and afraid of leaning into Japaneseness. For most of my life, I tried to avoid seeming Asian. I am half white. By dyeing my hair lighter colors and trying to avoid stereotypical Asian female speech and mannerisms." Emotional responses, not surprisingly, also have emerged as a legacy of the camps. These were mentioned by 15% of respondents. Most mentioned were negative emotions of sadness, grief, and anger, as exemplified for this quote. "So much loss, shame, sadness. Our family members are still struggling as 70 to 90-year-old elders. And my generation sees all that. Will we still be that traumatized in 60 years? Another wrote, "I feel so much rage and anger when I think of what was taken away from my grandfather and grandmother, and subsequently from me, but more so from them. I think I take what I see as passive yet graceful acceptance of what happened to them, and I have channeled it into rage and anger towards government and all authority figures." Another Yonsei had a similar sentiment, saying, "I've walked around with a sense of unease and anger my whole life, partly stemming from this family experience of being branded and cast out. Anxiety and depression are my companions in my life." Importantly, however, Yonsei also noted that the incarceration has been a source of pride, admiration, and inspiration in their lives. As this one noted, "I believe learning about my family's history has impacted me positively, in that I am proud of my background and feel strength from not only how I was raised in value, but in ethics as well. I believe that learning about the struggles and obstacles of what my family went through give us a better life has made me more proud and given me courage to stand up for my beliefs." Another Yonsei put it this way, "Early on in life, it gave me a sense of pride. It armed me with a sense my family and ethnicity had more than proven itself, more than sacrificed, been more than American in every way, even if people around me might second guess. I had an internal righteousness about the price for belonging in America that had been paid on my behalf." So these are important, I think, examples of the resilience that has been passed on. Negative impacts on both personal and intergenerational mental health were also noted by almost 9% of the participants. These reflected a range of issues, including anxiety, alcoholism, depression, and hoarding. As one put it, "I have a great deal of anxiety, which I have had all my life, and I attribute this, on some level, to the anxieties of my mother and grandmother, which was a direct result of the internment." Another respondent commented, "All Yonsei in my family suffer from anxiety, depression, PTSD, and other trauma-related issues." And still another noted, "My grandma would buy things in excess and stock up on so many things. My dad and older sister both learned this behavior. They buy whatever they want, and they buy more than they need because You never know when you might need it. I have some of this compulsion in me, but I fight against this daily. The intergenerational nature of this trauma is really well captured in the next response. My grandma became an alcoholic and was emotionally abusive to my mother. My mother, to a great extent, was neglected with her post-camp trauma because her parents were simply trying to survive the economic devastation post-internment, and also because they did not know how to process this kind of traumatic experience as a family. "60% of those who participated in this part of the survey identified as being multiracial, and 39 respondents mentioned impacts related to their mixed race perspectives, as exemplified by these two quotes. The first quote describes incarceration as a link to the Japanese American community. She said, "Being mixed, I don't always feel like I have a claim to my Japanese heritage, but having my grandparents in camp links me to this community and the other people in it." And the second quote highlights the incarceration as serving as a reminder about being of non-white status. This respondent said, "Learning that anyone with a blood quanta as low as 1/16 were rounded up and put in camps made me realize that it could have been me, that to white America, I am not white." Finally, the last thing I wanted to highlight is financial impacts. Yonsei mentioned of financial impacts were primarily noted in two ways. One way was related to lost generational wealth, as described in the first quote here. We also lost 60 plus acres of valuable farmland, so it probably lost a good amount for future generational wealth. Another way of mentioning financial impact was related to an alternative future, as shown in the second quote. At times, I wonder where my family would be financially, which spirals into, would I have gone to private school? Would I have different social circles? Where would I live if my ancestors hadn't lost it all in the war? Although much less mentioned, I do want to note that 18 respondents indicated that they did not see the incarceration as having had an impact on their lives. This is well reflected in the first quote here, which is, "I rarely think about incarceration and do not feel like it has affected my life very much." Another person wrote, "I don't think the incarceration has affected me at all. My parents didn't seem to be affected by it either because they never talked about it." So to summarize, these preliminary findings, I think, suggest several things. The past is not the past for Yonsei, who continue to experience a range of incarceration impacts. These impacts, as I noted, were most frequently related to identity, but we also see that sensitivity to social justice, family dynamics of silence and emotional distance, attitudes towards the US, and impacts on educational and career choices emerged as well. Resilience was noted in addition to the negative consequences. Comments on negative mental health issues are important for concern. At the beginning of this presentation, I mentioned that the numbers reflect only what people wrote spontaneously in their surveys. They were not asked to describe all of the ways in which incarceration had impacted their lives. This means that the frequency I've been talking about likely represent an undercount of each theme. If a respondent commented only about the impacts on their identity, this doesn't mean that they didn't experience impacts on mental health, family dynamics, or any of the other themes that have been mentioned. So given this, I think that the presented frequencies here are the tip of the iceberg, that there is so much more to learn about the impacts of the incarceration on Yonsei today. So just in closing, I want to make sure I make some acknowledgements and thanks. These are all people who have helped really in important ways. First, I want to thank all of the Yonsei participants who took this time and effort to complete the survey and offer their perspectives. I also want to thank the University of Michigan and my research assistants. And thank you as well to Densho and Tsuru for Solidarity for their assistance, not only tonight, but also in helping to distribute the survey information and link when it was first being launched. And finally, thank you to those who shared out the survey as well through their personal contacts. So with that, I will finish, and do I turn it over to you, Daryn?
Yeah, that'd be great if you perfect. Donna, thank you so much. I mean, before I move on, I just, as a Yonsei myself and hearing a lot of these themes that have emerged, just truly impactful for me, both in a mental health space and in terms of identity. So thank you so much for your work, both with the Yonsei Project and now with this. So I would like to welcome Brandon and Satsuki. If you two want to turn on your cameras and microphones, we will transition into the panel discussion. Satsuki and Brandon, Satsuki, you can go first. If you want to kind of give just a brief introduction of what you do, and then kind of move on to just any general thoughts that you might have with regards to the presentation. And then Brandon, if you don't mind following Satsuki, then that'd be great.
Sure, thank you. And thank you, Donna, for launching this amazing research project and the work you've done over the decades, helping Japanese Americans understand themselves. Really appreciate your work. My name is Satsuki Ina. I use she, her pronouns. I live in Albany, California. I am a Sansei born in the Tule Lake Segregation Center, maximum security concentration camp during World War II. I am co-founder of Tsuru for Solidarity. I was struck by a couple of things. One is how articulate the respondents were to be able to name their experience as articulately as they did. And also related to that is the recognition that didn't exist for the sanseis, that the incarceration had an impact. I think just from the clinical work that I've done with Japanese American clients, oftentimes I would have to introduce the concept of the incarceration as an impact on the family. It was not common that a client would come in and say, I think I'm depressed, or I am having PTSD, or my grandmother or my mother is suffering from the consequences of their incarceration. So it's only, in my experience, started to be a point of beginning for someone in therapy to ask, is this a part of my legacy of the incarceration? So I think your study has really targets and gives context to a lot of the family dynamics and the mental health issues that current generations of Japanese Americans are experiencing. So I think you've made a huge contribution to the work of our community healing from that trauma by being able to name it. Yeah.
No, I agree. I was just going to say that these is just a fraction of the comments that people wrote. There are so many more that, again, are, as you point out, are incredibly articulate and sort of descriptive of the experience that is quite striking.
Go ahead, Brandon. Yeah.
Yeah, this is overwhelming, actually. Donna, thank you so much for that incredible presentation. It's a rare thing, I think, to be asked questions so directly and so explicitly about one's own experience, and then to have the opportunity to answer them. I felt and this probably sounds, I mean, this definitely sounds morbid. I felt like I was observing an autopsy on my own experience, in the best possible way, but also in a way that I kind of felt was both poignant and heartbreaking in certain ways. So thank you for that, Satsuki, Daryn, Densho, Tsuru for solidarity. My name is Brandon Shimoda. I'm a Yonsei poet and writer, and I'm a professor of creative writing and Japanese American literature at Colorado College, which is in Colorado Springs on Southern Ute and Ute Mountain Ute land. And I'm just really grateful to be here. One thing, maybe just to respond right off the top, is that 74% of the respondents were women. And I would love to talk about that. I think that's remarkable. I was thinking, as I was listening and thinking about how so many people articulated this idea of intergenerational trauma and how that trauma has been passed down from grandmother through mother, through child, that it feels very much like storytelling. As I was thinking about like the significance of especially matrilineal storytelling, and how in many ways that's the province of grandmothers and mothers and daughters, which of course I exist on the outside of, but how trauma and storytelling might be connected, how trauma might be a story or a way of telling a story in very complicated ways. But that's what I'm thinking about now after everything you just shared, Donna.
That's something that Satsuki, if it's okay, I wanted to ask you, just because we're all going to hear this term a lot, intergenerational trauma. And while, most of us have experience dealing with it, Satsuki, I was wondering if you can describe a little bit more. I know it's somewhat self-explanatory, but what is intergenerational trauma? How does it manifest? And especially in your practice, how have you seen it manifested specifically within families, for example?
Yeah, sure. Let me just say I'm getting over a cold, so I'm popping cough drops, and if I go into a coughing spasm, I'm going to mute myself. So first of all, the word trauma has only recently been applied to our experience having been incarcerated. The World War II experience was suppressed in so many ways, and so much euphemistic language used to describe what actually happened. And then the silence that was the result of that is a symptom of trauma. So our whole community suffered this trauma. And so the silence is part of the crime of the trauma that we survived. So I think what happened is, without any labeling or definition or reality and truth about our imprisonment, people didn't make the connection, but they were living out a traumatic consequence after life. And if we look at it from this larger perspective, not just the individual, but the whole community who were separated, sent to different parts of the country, families were split up and fractured, and people lived a life of not knowing. They suffered the torture of indefinite detention. There was cruelty and depersonalization that happened in the prison camps. So there is a coping response to trauma that people don't name unless they go into therapy and the therapist names it and helps them put their behaviors or their beliefs or their ways of being in relationship into the context of a traumatic response. So child rearing becomes connected to how a person feels that they should help their child survive. So through their modeling, and that could be this very anxious way of overprotecting or pressuring the child, and also the child observing the parent overachieving or compensating in so many ways, or tolerating not getting hired or not getting promoted, and observing their parent experiencing this kind of diminished way of being in the world, gives a message to the child about how to survive in the world. And so then they carry on with that same traumatic consequence, and it impacts the way that they parent their child. Now, we also know from a neuroscience perspective that trauma alters the nervous system of the victim. It actually creates this extended, and sometimes for a lifetime, anxious way of being in the world. And for children, it actually modifies the brain function. The nervous system actually is in anticipation of threat all of the time, and leads to practices, behaviors, ways of relating to other people that is a function of this biological change that neuroscience has shown happens when somebody is in a constant state of threat. So if you think about people, the Nisei Sansei children who are imprisoned without knowing the degree to which they're going to be punished, the extent of the term that they're going to be held without knowing where they're going to be. My mother wrote in her diary that I wonder if today's the day they're going to line us up and shoot us. And so that level of trauma sets the nervous system up for anticipating threat. And so we develop these compensating behaviors that we see, things like hoarding, overachieving, anxiety about relationship, and often manifests outwardly as anxiety and depression. So it gets passed on in two ways. One is by the child observing and the parent conveying messages about how to survive in the world. And also there is this neuroscience that shows us that there are actual physiological changes that are a result of particularly chronic states of trauma like incarceration. I could do a whole semester on this, but that's I hope that helps.
Yes, it does. Thank you. And, Don, I know we've talked previously about this, so I'm sure it will kind of relate this question, but what are some differences that you saw between the Yonsei Project? I know you're still kind of dissecting the information, but what are some differences that you saw in the responses between the Yonsei Project and then previously your Sansei Project?
Yeah, thanks, Satsuki, for that great description. And I also just wanted to, before I answer, Daryn, your question, say something in response to what Brandon raised. I want to just acknowledge that my academic presentation and fast PowerPoint presentation doesn't do justice to all that goes behind the comments that people made and contributed to my survey. I wanted to give as wide an overview as I could, but obviously with the time constraints, I had to sort of do it very lockstep the way I did. But I just wanted to acknowledge that it really falls short from conveying what the power is behind the words that I'm sharing. And that, as I said, so many more comments from Yonsei were submitted than I even had time to share. But so I just wanted to note that as well. So main differences, I would say, from when I did my Sansei project, that was done some 30 years ago when the Sansei were the same age on average as the Yonsei that just participated in this survey. So it's kind of an interesting comparison there, just developmentally in terms of where people were at. I would say that two main ways that I feel like it's different is that the Yonsei were much more likely to name and really provide some detail about mental health consequences. Satsuki talked about this just a bit ago, but I think for the Sansei generation, that was not nearly as available as a way of framing what their experience was. When I did the Sansei survey, what I was surprised by is this was when it was paper and pencil, way before the internet and online options. They completed a paper pencil survey and had to send it back in a stamped envelope. But people wrote comments at the end of their survey saying, thank you for doing this research. I thought I was the only one who had issues of communicating about the camps, or that my parents wouldn't talk about it. I never realized that this was a thing. And so inadvertently, my survey ended up being an intervention of sorts, because Sansei just hadn't connected with each other and framed this at all. And that feels really different with this Yonsei survey. It seems like people have kind of a more ready access to understanding it. And in specifics, in understanding it around mental health consequences and being more comfortable, perhaps, in sharing that in a survey context. So I would say that's one main difference. And the second one was the really strong expression of concerns about combating injustice, and not just on behalf of sort of around issues of the incarceration specifically, but more broadly, that a sense of responsibility given our family history and my connection to what happened during the war. I'm going to stand up for other groups. I'm going to be on the lookout for when there are abrogations of people's rights. And that came across pretty loudly in this group, I would say, and more strongly perhaps than I might have seen with the Sansei some 30 years ago.
Now, Brandon, I wanted to ask you, as a storyteller myself, I think a lot of what we do is dive into the emotional and psychological patches of the intergenerational tapestry, right? Which I think differs a lot from the clinical perspective and the academic perspective, what you find in textbooks or even in oral histories. With your writing and your poetry, things like mental health, the emotional aspect, the silence of the generations that came before, how does that play into your work? Or how do you feel like you as a writer poet fit in through, into this landscape of the intergenerational history?
Yeah, I mean, I first want to just point out that you made a film in which a character cuts themselves open, seppuku, which since seeing it, I mean, at that moment really has haunted me, but also it seems such an accurate representation of what we each have to do. Because I feel like, in a way, as I was thinking about storytelling, is that it's a story that we keep telling ourselves over and over again. I think one of the really fascinating things about Donna, looking at your book on the Sansei, and then now thinking about the Yonsei Project, is that there still is, in many ways, a requirement to tell the story from beginning to end with each individual who is a descendant of it. It's like that's something that we're sort of indentured into, is this constant rehearsal of this thing that remains somewhat mysterious to the younger generations. Yeah, Daryn, I mean, that's a really good question. I think it's a huge question, and maybe your word tapestry is like a way to enter into it, because thinking about silence, for example, that's the background, or that's the tapestry out of which I feel like my creative work emerges. That if I grew up in a culture of sound, for example, where people were talking more openly and freely about their own experience and our familial and ancestral experience, creativity might not have been a consequence of that for me. Because I feel in so many ways that silence is actually the thing that infused within me this energy that eventually articulated itself as questions. I know when I was young, and maybe it's the anxiety that Satsuki is talking about, which I still have, but when I was young, I was like filled with some kind of unquantifiable energy that I think ultimately found its way into writing, storytelling, poetry, but it took a long time to get there. And I think in between was just trying to figure out what questions I needed to ask in order to crack open that silence. That took a long time to even know what it was that I was supposed to be asking, because nobody was equipping me really with that. And as I've mentioned before, I grew up on the East Coast, which in a way is like Siberia in relation to this history. There is a way in which I understand my father's his movement to the East Coast to be a form of exile, I think, from the things the things and the communities that that made him deeply uncomfortable. He's not here to defend himself, so I'm unfairly representing his experience. But yeah, I don't know. The question about how it weaves into creativity is huge, and I think I make work in a way to answer that question, or at least to look at it, because ultimately I really have no idea.
Yeah, I've talked to Lisa Doy about this a lot, and because of, you bring up a very astute point about this idea of silence, right? And for me, at least, the biggest thing that's silent are the emotions of what has transpired over the many generations. So as a storyteller myself, as woo-woo as it sounds, I try to channel, my ancestors' emotions and psychology, and bring that visceral experience to the forefront, that I think even if you watch a lot of oral histories, you very much see a guarded wall, right? And that's, a guarded emotional wall, as they recount their stories just in a matter of a fact way, or even my grandparents, the way they told it was just matter of fact, right? And the emotional aspect was very much suppressed. So it kind of leads me to this another big question, and Satsuki, I'll direct this at you, is obviously there is no one specific way, but how do we heal? What are the different ways that we heal?
I think what we're doing right now is a healing experience. Reaching out to each other, not being isolated, hearing other people's perspective, talking about the incarceration, sharing. Donna is reading comments from other people, but in that way, sharing how people are holding this experience of the incarceration experience. So one of the things that I heard a lot in therapy with Yonsei clients was a feeling of disconnection with community and this kind of aching, longing. And so when we get together like this, even on Zoom, I feel like there is a healing that takes place because we're not so isolated and alone. And the other thing that I've learned too in the work with Tsuru for Solidarity is that when we use our traumatic suffering as a leverage point to stand up and speak out on behalf of other people today, there's a healing in that, a way in which we feel more empowered than our parents felt, or that we were encouraged to feel. And I think this intergenerational connection is a way of healing the intergenerational trauma too, that we work together in programs like this. If you look at all the images of people who are participating today, this is an intergenerational experience. There are many people here of all 3, 4, 5 generations listening to this same program. And in that way, we are connecting in ways we couldn't in the past. So I think when we share our stories, some people write the stories for us so that we could then share how we connect to it. I think Donna's work as a researcher and sharing that out with the community, that doesn't always happen. People do research and then write their book and then they're gone. And Donna's work has always been socially conscious and caring about our community. And so providing that kind of information for us is also a source of healing. So, and I love hearing the number of people who had a social justice perspective, because in that way, it's the latent voice of protest that we didn't experience ourselves. To be able to feel that kind of indignation in the fourth generation is, a voice that I think our grandparents have been waiting for. So the other thing that happened after redress too is that there is a plethora of creative expression that was suppressed for many of the sansei. Now us elder sanseis are starting to express more, but the yonseis are, theater, poetry, literature about the camp experience has just been incredible, and a source of a reflecting mirror of our experience and trauma, which is also healing. I think talking to our family, I always tell people, start there. Talk to your family. Maybe it's uncomfortable, but instead of silently tippy-toeing around someone's discomfort around it, to be able to, with love, approach the subject and create this empathy that goes both ways between parent and child, I think can be very profound.
That's an interesting point that you brought up, Satsuki. When I made my film, it actually opened up my grandparents' generation in terms of communication and what they decided to talk about, partly because they said that, they didn't think we were interested in it. And then secondly, I don't know, maybe an inspiration or whatever the fact may be. I do see a lot of artists nowadays, right? 4 or 5 generations down. Do you all feel that has inspired or unlocked something within survivors and even sansei to be able to express more? And this is kind of directed at anybody.
I think just briefly from my perspective, I would say definitely yes. I think we tend to have this model of thinking that role models are always our elders. I think this goes the other way too, where, Yonsei with bringing their energy and creativity and sort of this openness to labeling the experience is a role model for me as a sansei, because I always feel much more restricted in the ways that I think about and try and manage sensitive topics. So I would say definitely from my end, it's been invaluable, and I really sort of an indication of how positive the direction can be going forward.
Yeah, Donna, along those lines, I'm actually kind of curious as a personal question, both your research on the Sansei Project and the Yonsei Project, how has it affected your own sense of identity? And if you needed it, your own healing journey?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it's an ongoing process. I have to say that there's a sequence with which I did my projects. I mentioned at the very beginning that this is my third research study looking at the incarceration across different generations. And when I first dipped my toe into these waters, I was very afraid of doing it. I felt like it was such a taboo subject, much as, even today, Yonsei talk about the silence and the hesitancy to broach it. And so my first project actually was with the Sansei, because I felt that it was within my generation, and that felt like a safe zone to work from. And then I worked from there to studying Nisei, because I felt I'd kind of gotten a little more comfortable in the space. And that much time had passed. So I felt like, at post-redress, Nisei maybe were more inclined to open up and talk about what happened. So then I come to the Yonsei. And so each of these studies, I think, has opened up other parts of the ways I'm thinking about this. So it's this funny dynamic of I study it as an academic topic, but it definitely is personal. It's my own life. It's my own family that I'm also digging around in and trying to understand. So I think each of them has brought another part to that puzzle. And as I said, it's not complete yet, but it's feeling like more of the picture is getting filled up.
Did her camera freeze, or is that just me? Well, while we wait for the camera and mic to come back, Brandon, I'll kind of direct this to you while we wait for Donna. One of the themes that emerged, and this kind of relates to everything that we're talking about right now, is the idea that the incarceration camps kind of led people into their career choices today, as well as, very much impacted their cultural identity. Can you tell us a little bit about what sparked your route as a writer and a poet? What inside you, or at what point in your life really sparked that moment where you knew you wanted to write about your experience of your family's experience?
Yeah, I think I'm waiting for an answer to come. I'm writing my way towards an answer to that question, Daryn, I think. I kind of had a serendipitous experience so my grandfather was in Fort Missoula, and I went to graduate school ostensibly to study poetry, which is what I did. I mean, that happened too, but I went to an MFA program in Missoula, Montana, and I wasn't totally conscious at that time that I would be living down the street from where my grandfather was incarcerated. I knew it, but I don't think I had really fully understood that that's where I was putting myself. And then it became clear when I moved there and I went to Fort Missoula, and I've written about this, but I went to they have a barrack museum, and in the museum there are, I discovered photos of my grandfather on the wall of that museum. And that was really the genesis of me wanting to write about my family. I think I maybe circled around it in more ambiguous ways prior to that. But I was struck by this series of questions that I was attempting to articulate by seeing images of his face and his body on the wall of this barrack. And I then realized that I'd been, in a way, kind of following him for years. I was living in all the places that he had lived, without really, obliviously, without even really connecting those dots. So I think that one way I really enjoy thinking about my relationship with my elders, my ancestors, and I'll use my grandfather just as a representation of that, is that there were certain things he was not allowed to say. There were certain things he was not allowed to do. The FBI, even after the war, would continue to visit his photography studio in New York City. And I have all this freedom to speak in ways that are uncontested, for the most part, in ways that he could have only imagined. One of the ways I really appreciate thinking about my relationship with him, and therefore all of my elders, is that I can send that freedom backwards, and that I can rethink and re-understand and imagine his experience through maybe the way that I can send the heirloom back in his direction, so that I can understand his silence, and I can understand his anger and frustration and everything else as actually a very creative, necessary part of his existence that is, in a way, a response to what I've been given from him. It's kind of like a very nonlinear, convoluted way of thinking about our relationship, but it sustains me. To go back to your original question, I don't know. I mean, it's a gift, really, for all the ways that it's so, that I still feel depressed and lonely and angered by all of this. What I do feel like I've received as a gift, and the way that I make use of that gift is by writing, and also being in communion with people like everyone who's here.
That's so beautiful, man, and so much that I can relate to, and yeah, it resonates a lot. We are running somewhat out of time for the panel discussion. So I think what I'll do is, I don't know if we have Donna back, but Satsuki, we'll start with you. Any closing thoughts that you have with regards to anything that you want to leave people with before we move on to the Q&A?
Let's do more of this. Let's feel comfortable getting together like this, creating our community across the country. And there are some visitors from out of the country that are joining us today. I think this is an example of what it means to heal, because we were so separated and divided, and to be in connection this way, I think, is how we will create community going forward. We're not going to have Japantowns forever. We're not going to have, Japanese American churches that bring us together way into the future. So I'm grateful for Tsuru and Densho for creating this opportunity, and hope that we can find more ways to do this.
Brandon, any closing thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think I just want to circle back to the very simple idea of sharing our stories. And one way of thinking of that very simply is like you tell a story to somebody else, you share it that way. But I also like thinking about it as we each open up our story for everyone else to contribute to, that we share it in that way, like a meal. And I think that does a lot. I mean, I think that, the meaning of the word heal is to make whole, WHOLE. So I think about sharing stories as a way for us all to make whole together, to heal together as sharing this. And that also is something I find really beautiful. I just want to mention something that Donna quoted, I guess somebody who is a writer maybe, who was saying that they write about identity, love, and intergenerational trauma. And I love that love is the bridge there between identity and intergenerational trauma, that fits right there in the middle and is obviously integral to all of this.
Did we get Donna back? Donna, are you here?
Could you not see me?
Okay, yeah, great.
I know. I don't know what happened. Something Zoom disappeared and then I came back magically. So
that's okay. Well, since you got cut off, is there anything you want to continue on, add, or in conclusion?
No, I really appreciate what Satsuki and Brandon are saying about the stories. And I guess maybe another piece to add to that, Brandon, you're linked to sort of your grandfather's experience, and sometimes things happen, right? There's like a bigger force in the world. And I think that's powerful. And just really quickly, I had a similar kind of thing in the sense that you were asking earlier, Brandon, about what I've learned from each of these projects and kind of how that links to my personal self. When I was starting the Yonsei Project, and then we moved here to Michigan, I was in Massachusetts earlier. When we moved here, my parents came to visit, and my dad asked me where on campus what the name of the building was that my office was in. And I thought that was a really interesting question. So I told him, I said, "Oh, my office is in East Hall." And he started to laugh. Now, I could not figure out why he was laughing. And it turned out that he had been, and this is a story he'd never told me, so I'm well into my adult life. He had told me that his one-way ticket out of Topaz was on a train to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and his job was washing pots at the bottom of East Hall.
Oh, God.
And my office was so in the building, and at the time it had turned into a naval training recruit center, and they had brought Nisei from the camps to wash pots and do that kind of work in the building. So I had this incredible sense of I was fated in some ways to do this work, and just so humbled to be a faculty member in the building that he had been sent to straight out of camp to wash pots in. So just pointing out that these bigger forces that are parts of our stories as well that can connect us.
Wow, that's that's crazy. Well, I want to thank all of you, all three of you for contributing to today's panel. And, I know I sound like a broken record, but Donna specifically, thank you so much for everything that you've done for our community, with all your research projects, for just being yourself, as gracious and kind and as warm as you are. It really has a huge ripple effect, and I could speak on it personally. It's largely impactful, both for myself and my family. So thank you so much. Really mean that. Okay, before we move on to the Q&A section, I am actually going to invite Lisa Doi to give her announcement real quick.
Thank you. Just want to echo Daryn's appreciation. This whole panel has been just absolutely amazing. But I know we're going to go for about 90 minutes. We know that some people might have to leave sooner. So I just wanted to make a few announcements. The first is that as we were doing registration for this, we also had registration for healing circles. So if you heard something today or just wanted to have more of an opportunity for discussion, the healing circles for those who registered are on Saturday, and they're at 1 p.m. Eastern, which is 10 a.m. Pacific. If you registered for it, you should have gotten a separate email about it. And also wanted to say that Tsuru for Solidarity is in the early planning stages of an in-person gathering around this same topic, around intergenerational healing, intergenerational trauma, and community building. Right now, what we know is it's going to be in late October in LA, but please stay connected to Tsuru for Solidarity on our social media and on our email for more information. We'd love to see all of the amazing people who joined us here virtually gathering in person as well. So thank you so much. I will hand it back to Daryn to open it up for our Q&A.
Perfect. Thank you, Lisa. Okay, I have a Google Doc here of people's questions. So I'll kind of be going through them and directing them at the panelists to see, whoever wants to respond, what you have to say. So the first one is from Roger. Has there been any comparison / correlation between JA/JC incarceration and the residential school experience of First Nations Native Americans, particularly the multi-generational effects? Does anybody want to answer that question?
I'm not aware of any research studies that have specifically looked at that, but I do know that the boarding schools is definitely a huge part of the literature on historical trauma with Indigenous American Indian and Canadian populations. So there is a body of literature that looks at that, but I've not seen something comparing the two. But others may be aware of that.
I don't know if this answers the question exactly, but the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the War Relocation Authority, they shared personnel, right? So the director, Dylan Meyer of the WRA at one point was also the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So from what I've read, there was a lot of cross-pollination, I think, of the policies that were used both in incarceration in Canada and the US, and also Native boarding schools, at the center of which was assimilation, this termination process that sort of ran on the engine of assimilation. I know there are people that are doing that research now, and it's really fascinating.
And then just a small thing, I don't know if this answers the question either, but Densho and I, in collaboration with Melissa, who is a Native American poet, we did this event called Haunted Healings. And so from a creative, spiritual, emotional, and psychological perspective, I screened my film Seppuku, and Melissa did some live readings of her poetry. And there was a lot of overlap both within our histories. For example, Japanese American incarceration camps also being, forced removal sites of Native Americans. But more importantly, the intergenerational trauma aspect, the mental health effects of depression, trying to use art as a way to communicate with the ancestors, fill in those historical gaps that have been erased. So there has been some artistic events, and Densho is one of the organizations that has held those events where we have explored that creatively. And full name is Melissa Bennett. All right, next question from Peggy. Does patriarchy also make a difference in whether Yonsei men are willing to share their intergenerational trauma? Anybody want to respond to that?
I don't know if I could respond specifically to Yonsei Min, but from a therapy point of view, it's a pretty typical percentage of men showing up for therapy as women. So I would say that just from personal experience as a therapist, it's often the wife that is dragging in the husband for therapy. And I used to point to the marks on my carpet of the heels that were pressed against the carpet to be brought into therapy. That men, particularly JA men, tend to be more reluctant than women to voluntarily show up for therapy. I don't know how accurate that is for the Yonsei generation overall, but certainly for Sansei and Nisei generation, it was more likely the woman that came into therapy, and sometimes the men would be threatened or dragged into the therapy room.
Brandon, I saw you nodding your head, so I wasn't sure if you had any comments on this.
I was just imagining those heel marks in the carpet. I mean, I think the first thing I noticed was that 74% of the respondents were women. And so I don't know if, I would love to hear from Donna about that. I mean, that's not like 51% or 60%, that's 3/4 of all respondents. So Donna, what sense do you make of that?
Yeah, and with that, Donna, real quick, was it the same for the Sansei and Nisei, overwhelmingly women that participated?
No. Always more of the women than men, but not to this extremity. And I don't have a real answer. When you write research papers, you always have this limitations section, and this would definitely be in my limitations sections about I don't have equal representation in this way. One of the things is it may have to do with the length of the survey, and maybe there's a difference in terms of how likely men or women are to hang in with something that takes a lot of time, because you wouldn't have gotten to that open-ended part until you made your way through a lot of those other rating scale questions. So that's one theory. The other is, I had mentioned that a lot of the publicity about this went through Densho and Tsuru for Solidarity. I don't know what the representation breakdown are for those groups. And maybe there's some potential, imbalance coming just from who heard about the study. But I don't really have a hard and fast answer to that.
I can only speak from personal experience. And I will say, growing up in the 80s and 90s in East Los Angeles, Asian men were very much emasculated in media. And so the wrong counter response that I had was hyper toxic masculinity. And to this day, it's something that is an internal conflict of mine, even as an artist, right? You suck it up, you man up, right? Phrases like that. You don't show weakness or emotion on the basketball court. And so I know for myself, even to come to a place to enter therapy, it took a long time, and it took a lot of destruction that I caused, and even self-inflicted destruction, in order for me to finally wake up and open up. And so I could speak for myself that in terms of a patriarchal culture, in terms of a hyper-masculine East Los Angeles culture, it very much impacted me. Okay, next question from Vicky. Can't figure out how to raise a hand for a question. Sorry, Vicky. Yeah, we might have that function disabled. Sorry about that. Could someone ask Dr. Nagata, having once said she did not wish to extend her study to the fourth generation, what finally motivated her to do so?
I did say that. So she must have heard me speak in some other context. I think it was unfinished business. You know, part of my hesitation to do the Yonsei study at the point when I was saying that was, you know, I was sort of at a lull in my research. I figured I could just sort of take it easy, kind of finish things off at that point, and that my hope was that there's a next generation of scholars who would take up the mantle and do the next part. But no one was really doing that yet. And then I found myself, I guess part of going back to that how does this personally impact me? I felt compelled to take this next study forward. And so here we are, sharing out some of what that is. And but I'm not going to do a Gosei study. I will. You can replay this webinar and call me out if I do that. But I'm feeling pretty confident that I'm going to be stopping with the data from this Yonsei project.
Well, we are all glad you did it, Donna. So thank you for doing this Yonsei project. Okay, next question's for Connie. How can I find out more about Dr. Nagata's research on the Sansei? Our Sansei generation in Canada is just really beginning to look at the effects of incarceration and intergenerational trauma. It's true that many of us did not even make that connection until recently. So I guess, yeah, how could they find out more about your Sansei project, Donna? And actually, any thoughts that people have, this is really anybody, about the Canadian community also?
Yeah, I don't know, and Lisa, not to just call you on the spot, but I don't know if there's an efficient way that I could send information out, not like one by one, but if people want some references, it could be done in a more straightforward way.
Yes, we could send stuff out afterwards.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
Okay.
I could comment some on the Japanese Canadian experience. Their Japanese Canadians have just received, I don't know the exact amount of funding to provide mental health care for survivors of the dispersal and incarceration of Japanese Canadians. And I could give you more details if you want to email me, satsukina44@gmail.com. I'm working with the organizers to set up healing circles for Japanese Canadians across the country that are very similar to the healing circles that people will be able to share on Saturday. So we're just working on that now.
I just want to take a minute to also, thank Satsuki for her tremendous efforts and activism related to incarceration and beyond. And, so we've been talking a lot about research here, but her clinical intuitions and insights and the work she does out in the communities is something also that I just wanted to make sure we recognize as well.
Very much so. Thank you. Okay, also, I've been informed that we have the capabilities to allow people ask their own questions, so I don't take up all this space, as I've been taking up too much already, probably. So, Wendy Tokuda, you had a question. Do you want to ask your question? If you want to unmute.
I was doing the boomer unmute trick. So I have several questions, but let me see if I can narrow it down to one. Dr. Nagata, I'm curious, have you gone back at all? And Satsuki, Dr. Ina, you could respond to this as well. Have you talked to your sons? I know we're talking Yonsei today, but have you gone back and talked to your sensei participants after all these many years? Because I'm sure their answers would have changed with all this life experience they got under their belt. I'm wondering how they might answer those questions differently. I'm struck, and I'll just add this one thing and I'll get out of your hair. I'm just struck as I get older, as I'm finally, in my 70s, able to acknowledge things that I certainly would not have been able to acknowledge 30 years ago, about the impact, the depth of the impact it's had on me. I'm just curious. Question for both of you.
Just real quickly, as far as I did not follow up with the Sensei participants, so that hasn't happened, but I would totally agree with you that as they've moved forward in their lives, and for many of them also, they now have Yonsei children. So the intergenerational is now also kind of going back and forth between Yonsei offspring and Sensei parents. So that's going to have an impact as well. So
I think also, in our lifetime, Wendy, we have the internet, we have redress, reparations. We've had really profound social justice actions and Asian American studies, and all of these things that have changed in our lifetime that we didn't have when we were younger. So that I think our comfort level at examining. Oh, did I disappear? Am I still on? Oh, our comfort level has speaking out, I think, has increased because of the technical and sociological changes that we've experienced in our lifetime. The other thing I just want to point out, that one of the consistent things through US history is the use of incarceration and removal for generations of many different groups of people of color. It has been a solution that has been used in the past, from the beginning of US history, and in the present. And we're looking at the long-term consequences of that across many communities, including our own.
Let's see. So we have a couple of different ways we can go. Joseph Suboy, you had a question. Do you want to unmute and ask?
Yeah, I will. Thanks, Daryn. Hi, Dr. Shimoda. It's good to see you. I was just curious because I was recently reading Processing Cultural Trauma again, and I've been thinking about the effects on Nisei men, right? Those under 60 who passed early on. So I'm wondering if any of those effects were made apparent by Yonsei in terms of gender, sexuality, and family formation.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think I've looked at it through those lenses. The level at which we've kind of culled through the comments is really for these just broader themes, but it would make sense to see if there's more specific reference to some of the things that you just talked about. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done still.
Okay, and then Ricky, I know you had your hand up for a while. Do you have a question?
Hi, thank you. I have a statement and a question. I'm Yonsei. Both my parents' families are from Northern California. They were incarcerated at Topaz. And throughout my life, I have been absolutely marveled at how they were able to look at the positive aspects of their lives in camp, of course, while dealing with severe adversity. For example, they would remind us that they met in camp, and as a result, they ultimately married. My question is, when groups face adversity together and subsequently overcome that adversity, or at least persevere, it seems that they have a stronger bond with each other. And I'm wondering if there's ever been any research done that compares those Japanese Americans who were incarcerated to those who weren't, to compare the communities that they each had. Again, I was very impressed growing up with the JACL, for example, and how many friends and the bonds that they had created. So that's the question. Any research?
The only study that I'm aware of that compared Japanese American who were incarcerated with Japanese Americans who were not incarcerated was done by Dr. Gwen Jensen. But she looked at Japanese American men and Japanese Hawaiian men and comparing rates of stress-related medical disorders and premature death, and found that by matching age and gender, that Japanese American men who had been incarcerated were more likely to die prematurely compared to Japanese American men in Hawaii who were not incarcerated, and other health-related factors. But other than that, I don't know of any other studies that compared outcomes between those who are incarcerated and those who are not.
I'm also not aware of anything that comes to mind on that, but one of the things that does raise a point for me in your comment is from my Nisei interviews that I did. One of the things that people talked about were the strong friendships that they established having been in camp together. And those friendships lasted for the rest of their lives. So I do think that there is this bond, and both in terms of people who met in camp and ended up being married later, but also just general friendships that really were incredibly strong. And as you mentioned, it's under extreme adversity that the bonds are being formed, but also they were confined to this space in this very kind of artificial way. So, but the overall take on these friendships was, this was one of the positives that they took from the experience, is these long-lasting friendships.
Well, I know we have a lot more questions on this Google Doc and, people with their hand raised, but unfortunately we are out of time. I think if it's any indication, going back to what Satsuki said, we need to do this again because there's a lot more to talk about, a lot more to dive into. So thank you so much to everybody, especially, I'm in Los Angeles, so it's only 6:30, but for those of you in different time zones who are up late, we really do appreciate you, sharing space with us and coming to be a part of this community and this discussion and being genuinely interested in everything that everybody has talked about here today. So thank you so much for joining us. Satsuki, Brandon, and Donna, thank you again for all the amazing work that you do in general. Thank you for the amazing people that you are. You three have very much impacted all of us in such profound ways. We really do. Thank you for your contributions and your dedication to helping us all heal. Just say it in that broad way. And Donna, thank you again for your research. We look forward. We know you're still dissecting and pulling everything apart, and there'll be more to reveal later on. Definitely take your time, but we will definitely look forward to what emerges in the future. All right. Thank you again, Densho and Tsuru, for solidarity. And I hope everybody has a good evening, good night, and a good weekend.
And thank you, Daryn, for doing such a great job keeping us all in conversation.
I tried my best.
Wonderful job.
All right, everybody, with love.
Thanks,
have a good one.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night.